Well, a wave of violence in Syria last week is highlighting the deep division in the country and posing a threat to domestic stability. Shocking violence in the northwest last week has reportedly left more than 1,000 people dead, including hundreds of civilians.
The widespread attacks have been allegedly targeting Alawites and mark the end of what had been a relatively peaceful few months following the toppling of the Assad regime in mid-December. Earlier, I was joined by Qutaiba Idlbi, Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council, and he says that there is still more work to be done to support former combatants to lay down their weapons and return to civilian life.
I mean, it's very challenging for the interim authorities to really go through a DDR process to really disarm the whole country after 14 years long of civil war. I think it highlights two things. One, that there is a lot of DDR processes needed, whether within the opposition rebels themselves, but also for what's estimated to be around 6,000 Alawite officers and fighters from the former intelligence and the military who are currently on the Syrian coast. But also it highlights the importance of starting a serious transitional justice process that would really try to close the wounds of the whole country, especially of the Sunni communities around Syria who have suffered for over 60 years of an Alawite-led regime that really left very deep wounds, as we've seen last week across the country.
So where does this leave the next steps and the near future for Syria?
So definitely, I think on the internal side, on the Syrian side, there's a lot of work needed, as I mentioned, to try to unify the country and definitely disarm the different individuals and groups who have long participated in the civil war, just to make sure that the country is on a stable platform, just so we ensure that the state does actually monopolize the use of violence. I think on the external side, however, there is a big role, especially for the United States, to play. Right now, Syria is under one of the strictest sanction regimes in the world, and it's really setting up Syria for failure. We can't really expect the country to stabilize, salaries are paid, reconstruction is started without the United States lifting some of its sanctions, mainly the Caesar Act that has been imposed on Syria for over 6 years now. So it's important for the United States to really start sanction relief and sanction lifting, so we can then really test the willingness of the interim authorities to put the country on the right path.
So how confident are you that the new US administration under President Trump and the Defense Secretary Marco Rubio is in? What is their appetite for lifting sanctions, and what would you like their engagement to be beyond that?
Right now, unfortunately, we have a Syria policy vacuum within the US administration, where the leadership for the Middle East policy and for Syria policy at State Department has not been appointed yet, and it's not expected to be appointed until June or July. So meanwhile, there are different officials within the Trump administration who are trying to take the lead on Syria. And to be honest, some of them do not really have the best of ideas in terms of there are some ideas about keeping Russia in Syria, other ideas about trying to bring back the Assad regime through another regime change in Syria, which would definitely lead the country back into probably the worst civil war that Syria and the region would witness. So I think there needs to be a more nuanced ideas that addresses the realities in Syria, that addresses the opportunity that it created itself with Assad escaping Syria back in December. There needs to be a direct diplomatic channel of engagement between the United States and Damascus to talk about US national security priorities, to talk about the transition itself, but also to ensure that there is a diffusion of the tension that exists today between regional actors, namely Israel and Turkey, that is happening on the Syrian ground.
Yeah, just finally, Qutaiba, I wanted to ask you about that. We know that Israel and Turkey have conflicting interests in Syria. Where does this recent instability leave the relationship between those two?
So unfortunately, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has really been utilizing tension around sectarian lines in Syria to really instigate instability in Syria. Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington back in February. And in a white paper shared with the U.S. administration, he really indicated the wish from the Israeli government for Syria to be unstable, for Syria to be divided among Druze, among Kurds, among Alawites, because Israel sees an existential threat coming from Syria with the support of Turkey in 20 years. And this seems to be very much a very bad self-fulfilling prophecy, in a sense that while Damascus has really indicated that it's not in the business of using Syria as a platform to attack countries around the region, specifically Israel, that Syria will be a source of stability, that it will make sure to keep Iran out. The Prime Minister Netanyahu government is really pushing actually Damascus to respond to Israeli instigation, but it's also very much flaming sectarian tension. I worry that this is, as I mentioned, is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy where Syria will have to run for Turkey and other regional actors to give them space in Syria, to give them more influence so they can stop Israeli attacks on Syria's sovereignty.
Qutaiba Idlbi, Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.